Thank you very much, Marie-Louise, and it's wonderful to see you here tonight. Thank you for coming along. Before we begin the conversation, I just want to take this opportunity to say some very important thank yous. First, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending this event tonight. Members of Olive Cotton's family are here with us, including Olive's own children, her daughter Sally and her son Peter. I want to welcome them especially, and other members of the Cotton and McInerney families. I couldn't have written this book without the assistance of Sally, who provided me with invaluable source material and her own wonderful reminiscences. She was unwavering in her support of the project. This book took a long time to write, as those who know me know all too well, and there are many other people in the audience who helped along the way, too many to mention here. I'm indebted to former and present colleagues at the ANU Centre for Art History and Art Theory, and I also want to pay tribute to my own fabulous family, some of whom have travelled a very long way to be here tonight. My writing was supported by funding from the Australia Council and the Research School of Humanities and the Arts at ANU, a Peter Blasey Fellowship, and the ABR George Hicks Fellowship. The resources here at the National Library of Australia and at the National Gallery of Australia have been fundamental to my research, reinforcing my belief that Canberra is an unrivalled place to carry out research into the arts and culture of our country and obviously of other places as well. The publisher, Catherine Milne, has been amazing. In her encouragement over many years, she would send me very persuasive but really lovely emails just to urge me to keep going despite all the difficulties that you have with long projects such as this. She was absolutely committed to producing this, what I think is a very handsome book. Scott Forbes and Lara Wallace and the team at HarperCollins have been a great pleasure to work with, and I'm full of admiration for their professionalism. Thank you to Catherine Favell here at the library for her long-standing interest in my research, and especially to the National Library for holding tonight's event. I am so thrilled that Alex Sloan has agreed to this conversation, and I can't wait to hear her questions. So would you join me, please, in welcoming Alex as we take the stage?
I'm the one who's feeling really lucky to be talking to Helen Ennis. We catch up a lot at the Ainsley shops, but this biography of Olive Cotton, typically I always try to finish the book that I'm in conversation about on the same day. And so this morning I finished Helen's book and I sat staring out the window for a very long time. I just sat there and actually it is dappled and I thought Olive would frame this in the most beautiful way. But my thoughts went to both women, to Olive, the woman and the artist, and to Helen, the woman and the artist. Helen Ennis has poured her incredible talents as a writer and a curator into Olive Cotton's story, and like Olive's photographs, it's been done with time, care, love, and a kind of selflessness. I just want to start with the final paragraph, actually, from Helen's book. Helen has chosen to write about Olive's photograph, which is a landscape photograph taken in the New England area, I think, right, called Light and Shade. And I'll just quote her. This photograph is the stunning affirmation of Olive's conception of photography as drawing with light, created at the height of her powers. The command of light and the daring composition are certainly impressive, but ultimately what endures is something less obvious, the impersonal quality of the photograph. By this I mean that the image is detached and the ego of the photographer, and by implication the viewer, are irrelevant. The world Olive depicts is humanless and huge, far greater than any individual could be. Thus, the significance of light and shade is not confined to Olive's view about photography. It can also be seen as an avowal of her anti-materialism, her abiding love of nature, and her gentle advocacy for a rapt engagement with the natural world. All of these sustained her to the end in her photography and her life. That's Helen Ennis for you. Helen, congratulations on a work of immense beauty.
Thank you.
It's like Olive taking her photographs, you waited for the right time, for the right clouds to come over in the right formation. Olive died in 2003, her husband Ross in 2011. You write that timing was everything, and I quote you, "It did not seem appropriate or indeed even possible to write her into being while Ross was alive, while he was alive." Tell me about that.
Okay, so what always drew me, of course, to this project was Olive's art photography. It's fabulous. And there was always the energy there. And with any project I've done, I always feel you go to where the energy is. Sometimes it's unresolved, sometimes it's restless, sometimes it's actually resolved, but in a way that still gives off a lot. So with Olive, there was always something there that drew me very much to her photography. That drew me to her also as a person. So I guess what happens there, Alex, is I had to think about what it is to write a biography. I knew I wanted to write a biography, but I do see a biography as a narrative. It is a story, and so I had to conceive of Olive also as a character. And I've used a lot of literary devices to try and bring her story to life. And I felt that she could be neither this character or this construction. If she were present, I would be deferring to her in all her reality and all her presence. And so it wasn't possible to really think about it until she wasn't there in the world along with me, because then she would still have been herself, not her character in my story.
And also with reference to Ross as well.
Yes. Because they had such a long marriage and such a long life together. And writing biography is an invasive project, as you'll all know, and things that you are told that inform the story, they're not always positive. And so it was important for me too that I not be trampling around inside their private lives while they were there. They were always the most gracious and generous of hosts, but I was a guest and a friend, whereas then I became a biographer. After their deaths, I became something else. And that's when I began to write them, I guess, into being.
You wrote in Meanjin, "I was shocked by the strength and immediacy of the impact on my biographical project. It was electrifying. All of a sudden, it was like a key going into the lock."
Yes, that's exactly right, because then I felt liberated. But having said that, it's not a fictional biography at all, and it's not a speculative biography. For me, it was always crucial to be true to what I saw as the evidence, different kinds of evidence. So Olive is the character because this is her life narrative, but it's my story of her life. She might have told another different one if she were writing an autobiography. Another biographer might have a different kind of approach.
Because you quote Janet Frame, and she says, "Writing of the dead is different, for the dead have surrendered their story."
Yes, and I believe that absolutely, yeah.
And so in that bush-circled cemetery, when Ross is laid to rest, away you knew this is a huge project. You actually tell us, you make reference to a room of one's own and the sort of space and the privacy that Olive... So to start writing this, you have a room of your own, Helen. And
I do.
And you had it repainted.
I do.
Tell us that story.
I gave myself a rotator cuff injury in the process because I clutched the roller too hard. My room was an egg yolk yellow, which I loved, but I knew I couldn't write about Olive Cotton while the room was that colour. So I had to work out from the paint charts what seemed appropriate, and it was a blue. Some of you in the audience, I can see you wearing it, but just a very light blue, a soft blue, because I needed to be extremely quiet in writing this book. I could never have any real noise around me. But a friend of mine, she said that blue is the colour of consciousness. I didn't know that at the time. And so it was a very perfect room, in fact, to be writing about Olive, yeah.
So to Olive herself, do you remember the first time you saw a photograph by Olive Cotton?
I don't remember the first one exactly, but I remember the feelings that I got immediately when I first began looking at her photographs. It's something about their resolution. They're very, very resolved works, but as I said, they have this kind of energy. So for me, of course, it was about beauty, it was about gentleness, about sensuousness, those kind of qualities, but also because I'm an historian of photography, they had something to say as well, an alternative view to modernist photography in Australia, less heroic, less dramatic. So I remember the feelings that came from that. And I remember too, very early on reading Max Dupain talking about the effect of seeing Olive Cotton's first solo show in 1985. And I'm just paraphrasing, but he said it was like walking through the bush and then coming across a calm, tranquil lake. He spoke about the therapeutic calm of her photography. And I've always felt a kinship with that statement too, that there's something there that draws me, that the energy from that.
It was a very beautiful thing that Max wrote, wasn't it? That was because when they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm reading this book, this beautiful biography of Olive Cotton." And the easy way to explain to people was, of course, the relationship with Max Dupain. Yeah. What do you think about that? I mean, is that do you hope this book might change that?
I do. I hope that there's new information about their marriage, so things that have never been published before. So I was able to have access to documents that other people hadn't looked at. I was able to gather recollections from people who knew them, because this is such a long-standing project. So even someone saying, "Oh yes, I had been to the studio in the 1940s," someone who was still alive then and who could say to me, "I saw Max treat Olive like a piece of the furniture." So I was able to get, these first-hand recollections still when the archive, if you like, was still alive and restless. So that kind of information is there. But there is a very extended discussion too about how active they were as photographers, as artists working together. They didn't imitate each other's styles. It was always assumed that Dupain was the dominant one and she was the lesser one, if you like, as we so often see in those professional relationships. But I'm convinced it was not like that. She certainly was not the photographer in the business. She was the assistant, but enormously proud of everything they achieved together. And Olive, right from the start, she had her own style and her own particular concerns. And you can see them as early as, I think in interior, my room is a photograph from 1933. It's there then. She's 22 years old. It's a photograph Max Dupain never would have taken. And you would find photographs from him that, from an early period, she couldn't have taken either. So really fertile, really active, really interesting the way they work together, but I think we have to give them full credit as autonomous, independent beings who accomplished a lot independently. And she made it quite clear later on that she said that she basically would brook no interference. With Shasta Daisies, one of her best-known photographs, it's on the back of the book, she said, "Oh, Max, he wondered what on earth I was doing climbing up the store, working in the studio," but she said, basically, I knew it would turn out all right, and sure enough it did. It gets hung in London in a salon of photography, the pinnacle of achievement for art photographers. So, yep, I think they worked really closely together. I think they loved each other incredibly from teens on.
Because they were kind of children, they grew up together,
They
didn't
did.
they? Yeah.
They met right before they started high school. So she was going to go to high school at MLC in Sydney and he was going to go to Sydney Grammar. So they meet as children, but right on that cusp, of adulthood. And they fall in love. I mean, they, first of all, are just connected by photography. They go to each other's places. They process negatives together. They're in the dark at the makeshift darkroom at his place and at her place. And then they become incredibly close. And I think there's absolutely no doubt they loved each other. But then as a marriage, as she said, sometimes marriage doesn't work. And in their case, it was very brief. She decided quite quickly that it did not suit her.
And what her father was a geology professor and had been on an expeditioner with Shackleton.
Yes.
And I wonder about the influence of her father as well, with her look to big nature and the bigness of the world.
I think it's crucial. And her father was Leo Cotton. He was Professor of Geology at Sydney Uni, and all reports are that he was just the loveliest man, a very gentle man, enormously talented. Olive grew up in a family of privilege, surrounded by luminaries. I mean, their achievements really are quite phenomenal. But yes, it was through her father, actually, that she was really encouraged in photography, because he had learned photographic techniques himself to take photographs of Antarctica on that trip, and they're in the Powerhouse Museum.
I wondered, with my crass kind of explanation of this book, and I thought I'll just stick on my crassness here. Who do you think's the better photographer?
Olive or Max?
I'm just going to go there, Helen.
Yeah.
I'm a journalist, so, you know.
So I suppose because I'm a very even-handed person.
Yes, you are. And you're a professor.
That's right. I think they have very different contributions to make, and I think that Max Dupain's photography is enormously important and fabulous, but I think that he often made too many photographs, in the sense that he had all these commercial demands on him, so he did more than 200,000. That's a lot of negatives. So Olive's output was really different, much more intense and concentrated. But I think that if I were to be told, could you take 100 Max Dupains and 100 Olive Cottons, you could make two fantastic exhibitions. Sean Lakin at the National Gallery did a show of Max and Olive, and you see them together, and they both are very fine photographers. But I just think that Olive brings to our conversation something very different in this contemporary moment. Obviously, hers is a woman's story, and this book is very much a woman's story.
It is.
And, that's crucial.
It's very hard, coming from a second-wave feminist generation, to not give a feminist reading over the top, and you warn us against that. You say quite clearly, Olive did not consider herself a feminist. Tell us more about that.
Yes, that's right. So Olive was at pains to point out that she saw herself, first of all, as an artist, as a photographer, not as a woman photographer. She didn't want to be categorised that way, but she did advocate for women nonetheless. So in one of her few public profiles in the 30s, when she gives an interview to the Sydney Morning Herald, she does talk about how she hopes that women will be much more involved in the photography arena. So she is a champion that way, and also of photography by other women and her friends. And if you look, and you will see some of these portraits go through, of her photographs of women, she absolutely understands women. I think she does some of the finest portraiture of women in this whole period.
Well, that I was doing that comparison between Max and I'm going to stop doing that. But the Sunbaker, and then the wind and that portrait.
The light, the wind,
That's all I want on my wall now.
Yes.
I think that is the most extraordinary photograph, and it is by a woman of a woman.
Yes, that's
in that
right.
moment of complete and utter rapture of nature.
Yeah, but also she allows her women to have an internal life and to have a power. Their power is a physical power, but it's also an internal power. So this is why her portraits of women, I think, are very complex. They're very sensuous, they're gorgeous to look at, but her women are complex beings. She is a complex being, and I've tried to make her as complex as possible, because there's no point rushing to judgment. And so if you were to do a feminist analysis, you might say very quickly, why didn't you do this or that? You know, you can...
Why did you put up with this?
Yeah, exactly. But
there are different questions at a different time.
Yeah, and it was a very complex thing. But she was committed all the time to... She believed in the value of an inner life, an imaginative life. And this doesn't just matter if you're a photographer. This is whether you're a painter or a writer or a musician. All of us who want to have a rich inner life will respond, I think, to what she is feeling there.
I'm jumping a bit, but there's an incredible photograph that you've included in the book when she has her studio at Cowra and she's doing a lot of weddings, and there's a photograph of a schoolgirl. It's
Jenny Coe. Yes, that comes through here too.
I showed it to my husband this morning. I went, take a look. That's a photograph of a schoolgirl, but it's something there's something else to it.
Yeah.
There's an incredible power to that.
Incredible power. And you'll see that there's a photo of...
She's a Wiradjuri girl.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, that's right. So really powerful. She's in her school uniform, but the way that she and Olive transact the photograph, the session, it's incredibly commanding. So the way that young woman looks into the camera, and you feel it, don't you? You feel the power of that.
I took time to look at, and you will when you reread this incredible book. But to leap back, the decision to leave Max, and she goes to a girls' school, actually to Frensham, to be a teacher. I mean, that was an amazingly strong and defiant decision, wasn't it?
Yep. And so in the book, I've tried to argue that there are these moments where she makes these audacious decisions. One is after finishing university, not to go and be a teacher, but to go into Max Dupain's studio. By then they really are a romantic couple, but she said, why wouldn't I do what I want to do? Photography is my passion, of course that's where I will go. And then yes, these are various audacious decisions, but to leave Max at that time, 1941, in the war, the divorce rate in Australia is minuscule, and she chooses to find a teaching position. It is in a very progressive girls' school. She's, again, got the company of women who were incredibly politicised and aware of what was happening in the world and of creating a utopian community, so amazingly supportive for her. And Max was blindsided. First of all, she'd made that decision to find the position, obviously without discussing with him, and then she was gone, and she said first she came back for a few weekends to collect some of her stuff, but only a few weekends, and then in their divorce proceedings you can see that he was completely shocked. He had looked so compressed for him, but she had made up her mind obviously some time before.
There's no doubt that Olive Cotton had an eye for physical and natural beauty, and this is the case when it came to the men in her life. I mean, they were beautiful men.
Yes, incredibly handsome men. Yeah, and Olive's granddaughter, Lucy Lehman, she does write about that too, yes, about Olive's taste in men.
Yeah.
Yes,
because that photo of Ross in uniform, looking directly at it's an erotic photo, isn't it?
And she says it was for his parents. So
he's not looking at his parents in that photo.
I think that was the beginning of the romance, 1942.
You come backwards and forwards. You really tease out her reasons for leaving Max, and maybe we'll leave that to the readers too.
Sure.
There's an incredibly heartfelt story, but I'll just leave that for you to read.
I guess the point here is that I use evidence to reveal things, but slowly, so that these things happen across a whole lot of chapters. And then late in life, Olive and Max get to think about their lives, in that life review phase, and so a little more comes out then. Yeah, but they then speak for themselves in a way.
The way Olive loved music, and there's something very musical in the flow of the way you have written. Tell me about that. Is that on purpose, or did that reveal itself to you?
Look, I always need a metaphor, a conceptual metaphor, and I have got a few going in this. One was that I was kneading a lump of dough, and mind you, I don't make bread. I'm terrified by the whole yeast process. I've got no affinity really or ability, but it was as if the dough had bubbles in it, and I had to, through the process of kneading, try and eliminate the bubbles, which were the big ruptures, but still allow enough breaks and things in between. So that for me was a metaphor of get rid of the big distress things, and then so drop it down a bit, but still have these moments which shift and register. So it's musical in that sense, because you can be going along and then it's like, oh wow, we've gone into another passage. But I also felt like I was dealing cards. I'm dealing this one, and then I wait, and then I deal this one, and then I wait, and then another one comes.
Well, and speaking of cards, I mean, the card she chooses when she marries Ross, they live in a tent.
They do, that's right.
It's not, she doesn't choose comfort.
No, she doesn't. And she stresses that her father, her parents, her whole circle is very unconventional in a lot of ways. And her grandfather there's a photo she took of her grandfather where she says that he's probably pointing to Russia on the globe. There's a little light bit because he was always interested in the 5-year plan. You know, he was a socialist. He was really fascinated by that. He called one of his children Karl Marx. He was called Max Cotton. So, yeah, she came from a family that was very progressive, not just politically, but thinking about science and art coming together, but in very creative, unanticipated ways, I think.
And I think Sally, who's here tonight, but tells you the story, and particularly, you know, I come from one of those country communities, and, you know, there is a sort of pressure to dress and look in a certain way in that era, which Olive didn't want to borrow.
That's right. Sally says how she didn't have her hair permed like the other farmers' wives and so on. She was prepared to be different, I think, to be audacious through many moments in her life. Yeah. Not all, but many, yeah.
You say Olive's public voice is hard to find with so little on the public record, but when it comes to her private existence, it's a different matter. Tell me about that. So to find that, because there weren't many interviews and she didn't like publicity.
No, she was very shy, retiring, reserved person, and in the second marriage Ross was the talker, and I think in the first marriage probably Max was the talker, even though people said how fun-loving and so on she was. So there wasn't a lot in terms of what biographers want, like diaries and letters and that you would be able to pore over. For those people who've read biographies on famous figures like on Manning Clark, where apparently, you know, there's just boxes after boxes where he's gone through and annotated.
And that was called An Eye to Eternity because he had a photograph taken of himself near a tombstone. I mean, he knew that this was going to be poured over.
Yes.
Olive is the opposite.
That's right. She's much more fatalistic. She has a very different view of time and of what it is we do in the world. So she wasn't ego-driven that way at all. Some might say she was too self-effacing, too modest, that was an issue.
What was most important to her?
Oh, look, I think if you talk personally, it would be family, absolutely no doubt, children, grandchildren and all that. But I think, yes, for me it's this idea of the natural world, you know, having a sense of its importance that goes way beyond you, that you already quoted, but of beauty in that too, and of having an imaginative life. Her sister-in-law said that Olive had a secret life. It was in her head. So we are so oriented to the external world. We give so little time to an internal life. And I think that's actually, I've said before that for me, biography, if it's going to have any relevance, is because the subjects of biography speak to us now. We're not just interested in them because of the past. So you have to think, what are Olive's invitations to us in our moment? And I think one of them is about that, you know, what really counts and what it means to have time on your own, you know, solitude. Sure, you can be part of a social world in that too, but to do the tough stuff in your darkroom, no one else there, and making your own prints.
There's many heartbreaking moments in the book, but the fact when you say, look, for 18 years, really she didn't take many photographs at all. It was about child rearing and family. And it's almost, she enters in the agricultural show and she doesn't realise that that's really out of vogue now. Tell us that story and that great gap in her career.
Yes, that's right. So when Olive moves to the country, and as Alex has pointed out, she's living in impoverished circumstances with her second husband, Ross. They have the children. It's a few years before they're able to move into their own home, still really basic. No electricity, not the access to water that you need if you're going to have your own darkroom and so on. So she's taking photographs, but she isn't able to print them herself. And she saw the printing as part of her creative practice. It was crucial. So she couldn't do that. She couldn't advance in that sense. But she'd never not stopped taking photographs, or I don't think she ever stopped probably thinking about taking photographs, but she wasn't looking at the work of others either, going to exhibitions or, you know, it was impossible in her circumstances. So the decision to enter into the agricultural show, the Royal Agricultural Show in Sydney, would have been crushing because she was rejected. And so if you think here was our most important woman photographer, or in the 30s and 40s, does such fabulous work, and then just a few decades later, doesn't even make the cut. So it's not until the 80s, really, that she begins to take her place in exhibitions.
What happens then?
It's largely through the retrieval work of feminist historians in Melbourne, Jenny Maber and Barbara Hall and Christine Gillespie, and they go there and they interview Olive, and they begin that whole process of the pilgrimage, which many people like me also made, to see her and to see her work. And Olive was so generous, she would show you things. She actually gave a lot of photographs away to her visitors in that period. Yeah.
When did you first meet her?
I met her first in the mid-1980s, and I kept visiting during those next decades with my family.
And do you remember your first reaction to meeting her and
yes,
the questions you started to ask about her?
Yes, I did. She's tiny. She was tiny. So that's one thing that happens, I suppose. You just have that physical disjunction. But incredibly modest. I've used that word modest before, but she did not like to talk about herself particularly, or even really about her photography. But Sally did a great series of really archival work, looking at photographs and recording what Olive was saying about them. So I was very dependent on that even more than talking to Olive directly myself, because she did not say a lot.
Because and there's a great part in the book when I think it's Sally and a friend pack up her studio in Cowra. That's quite revealing as well, isn't it?
It is, that's right.
What was in that studio. And
if you do look at the photographs, you'll see even on the wall in the 60s, she's got teacup ballet and some of the photographs from the Sydney years, because there's been that big gap, and she joins it by calling herself Olive Cotton when she opens the studio, but she also joins it by putting then the Sydney photographs in there to establish that continuum. And by that point, she's too frail when she's packing up the studio. Olive is by then too frail to do her own printing and so on. But she still wanted to photograph. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Yes, Sally.
Great portrait.
The great quote, I think, she says, "Photography is drawing with light, and that is my greatest interest." Tell me your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so she says that she's not making photographs, in fact, for other people. She's trying to satisfy herself. And what she sees in light, I mean, this is where I would argue there's something fundamental about her contribution. She's got all those values that come from scientific observation, and then all that aesthetic and refined sensibility, her sort of exquisite sensitivity. Somehow she brings the art and science together. So her work is very rational. It's not irrational or illogical. It's actually really ordered. But at the same time, yes, it has these great invitations to open-endedness and beauty and other things that make them so appealing, make the art photographs so appealing.
Now, I'll just put you all on notice, and we can get a microphone to you. I'm going to open it up to questions very soon, so I would love you to put your hand up and just keep it up, and we'll get the microphone to you. But I'll just because just while I've got Helen to myself for a moment, how important is Olive Cotton in the history of Australian photography? Where do you put her?
I put her right up the top. I do. For the period of modernist photography in the 30s and 40s, I put her right up there in the top group.
Why?
Yeah, because even if we just talk about that unification of the scientific and the aesthetic, but to this gentler vocabulary that I've spoken about too. Shasta Daisies, if I just use that as an example, that's the one that's on the back of the cover, that she thinks that all things are of equivalent value. I mean, she really is an egalitarian, democratic photographer. She doesn't single out a particular flower when she does her flower studies. She looks at a group, and every photograph has this kind of, every flower in those studies have an equivalence. She does it when she photographs the Budapest String Quartet too. There's 4 blokes in there, but they all have the same kind of reality, if you like. So I think that's really interesting when modernist work so often makes something hierarchical, and she doesn't do that. She's much more interested in egalitarianism and democracy, and I think that's radical. I think that's great. But it's her subject matter too, the fact that she does draw these things from the natural world. It is those photographs of women, and it is this idea of the viewer. Like, she's never a table thumper. She's never didactic. She wants you to have a space in which you will operate and connect with those photographs. So when she says in that, okay, I'm making them for myself, she actually, it sounds like it might be an egotistical statement. It's not. It just means she's got to be satisfied to her particular standards, but she leaves an abundance of room for you. And I've tried to do that too with the biography.
Well, that
I've tried to match, that kind of thing. If we talk about music or rhythm, that somehow there's a space for you to make your own decisions and
I think you've just done that beautifully. And I just saw the photo of Jenny Coe just come up there. Helen in the book stops us and just will single out one of Olive's photographs, and then does this sort of masterclass in terms of explaining the photograph to us. It's so beautifully done. And this is, of course, your background as a curator and as an academic. So that you did that on, again, as a sort of the rhythm of the music, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And because those are your moments of contemplation, it's me saying to you, look, all we have now is this photograph and you, and we're a part of a three-way thing. I'm just telling you a story about this particular thing. So those chapters are just a page or two, so they're meant to slow down the whole thing again. Yeah.
It's hard not to get cross with Ross and Max.
Yeah, I agree. No, I'm with you there, Alex.
There's an account, and familiar with these kind of characters, might have been my own father, but the account of Ross when there is a film being made about Olive, and the producers go, okay, well, because she's been taken up by the film, the producer says, we'll get food brought in for Ross. And then he complains about the food. So she still has to go and cook it's sort of...
Yeah, I was told lots of anecdotes about all sorts of people, and this is where the card thing I'm telling you, I don't play all my cards because some of the stories, they are distressing.
They're tough.
Yeah, they are.
And I guess it was a different generation and a...
Yeah, but Olive finds her way through it. So I think that's where, in the end, we don't have to feel sorry for her and make
I don't
a
feel
judgment
sorry,
on her
but
behalf. No, but
I feel cross.
Yeah, yes, that's right. Because what she gives us...
She's never a victim to me.
No, she's not, that's right.
She's most extraordinary.
Yeah.
And what Helen has done here is just so beautiful. So just get ready with the questions. I did love Bruce James, the quote.
Yeah.
Will I read it?
Yes, by all means.
Art critic Bruce Jones wrote this after seeing Olive's work. I called Cotton a force for change. What does that mean? Save that I'm struggling for a cliche that won't stunt her. I think she's among a small group of artists who are causing us not simply to know ourselves better as a people, but to like ourselves more. Not simply to admire the environment, but to reverence it. Not to look at Australia, but apprehend it. That's just such a great...
It is. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's just beautiful. And I think that's exactly thank you so much for... All I want is an Olive Cotton photograph now. But let me, please put your hand up. I'm sure you've got lots. There's so much in this book and I'm just picking out bits and pieces. But put your hand up and ask some questions of Helen. Don't be shy. I can keep talking. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful insight into Olive's life. I knew a bit about Max Dupain. My mother actually worked for him briefly in Sydney as a young woman, but knew nothing of Olive until about the 1980s, so thank you. It's a very plebeian question. Is there any celebration of Olive's work in Cowra? It's a great country town, but do they celebrate her at all there?
No, in fact... so the book's been out just for 3 or 4 weeks, and where we had the first launch was in Cowra, for the Cowra people and Cowra community. They are enormously proud of her, and there are photographs in that gallery's collection. They are trying to raise money to buy more works by her. And yes, once she was, a photograph by Olive appeared on a stamp. Teacup Ballet was on a stamp in the late 80s, and then it's like her fame really grew like wildfire in Cowra. And yes, they're phenomenally proud, and they hosted the show that went from the National Gallery just recently, just last year, and they plan to have a talk in that next year too. So it's an ongoing commitment to her and her work.
Now, any other questions? Just put up your hand and we'll get the microphone just over here. Thank you so much. It's just coming to you here. Thank you.
Hi, Helen. I'm just wondering, with the variety of work, when you sort of see artists these days, they sort of concentrate on a certain genre or a certain whatever, and she was quite prolific in quite a wide variety of imagery. So can you comment on that?
Yep. Now, that's a great question because it actually goes right to Olive's oeuvre, what we would call an oeuvre, it's the body of work. And when you look in the 30s, she tries out all sorts of things. She's a young woman in her 20s, part of this really vibrant environment. So she's photographing a little bit in the city, but she's doing still lives in the studio. She's going out into the natural world with her camera. She's making portraits of her friends. So that's, in fact, where you see the most variety in her subject matter. And then later on, when she does come back to her art photography and just immerses herself in it, it is more restricted. It's the natural world that is the bridge between the two phases. So once the studio is open, the first really strong photograph she makes again, this is now in the 1960s, so as Alex pointed out, there's an 18-year gap. It's flower studies, just what she had been doing in the 30s. And so for her, it was as if there was no break. There she was again in the studio, taking in what she said is for her the Cherokee rose was the most perfect. She loved the flowers for their form. She talks about that. So there were particular flowers. She's not running a campaign about Australian natives, Indigenous plants, or even about exotics. It's not the most expensive lilies and orchids. It is the things that are growing in her garden and round about, quince blossom, chester daisies, wild plum, all these sorts of things. So more variety early, and then later on, much more settled and much greater focus on the natural world.
Great question. Any other questions? Just put up your hand. We'll get the microphone to you. Yes, just here.
Oh, hi, Helen. I was just wondering, the photographs of the houses that she lived in, the two houses in the countryside, they look pretty wrecked.
Yeah.
Do you think that they were like that when she lived in those houses?
Yep. So the key thing I think there is that they were incredibly simple, but of course much more ordered when Olive did live there. But the second house, which is the house that we knew her in and visited her in, is two construction workers' barracks that are smushed together. So what's so interesting then is when they get that's a big improvement in their living conditions, but they never erase the signs ever of the people who'd lived there before. So inside, that's why I use the example of her door. The Dymo tape label on her door is the name of the previous occupants because the workers had all the bedrooms. And so when you go into Olive's house, you can see the names of the workers who lived there before her. So certainly there were some aspects of the housing that did improve, but there were other things that I found really curious like that she accepted. She didn't, and Ross didn't feel the need to paint
because with
things
her eye
and
for detail,
renovate
as you said, all it needed was a quick tug to take that diamond.
Yeah.
So she must have looked at it every day.
That's right, but she chose not to do things like that. And the yard always was in disarray, but it looked like disarray in the sense that it was so full of stuff. And I try to use the houses as another kind of documents because we've already mentioned that there's Olive didn't leave behind a lot of stuff to give me access to her inner life. But the houses, I mean, how often with a biographical subject can you see that every house she lived in, from Waroona, the beautiful house in Hornsby, to the barracks that were at Spring Forest, that they're still there, so you can go to them. So there's all this profusion, but in the end I realised that in there actually was very little of Olive, because there were 17 car wrecks. You'll see those, the Austin cars, but they belong to Ross, not to Olive. And so the area where there were all the stoves, or the area where there's all the beekeeping paraphernalia and so on, that's not actually hers. So even though that's her home, she's as absent there in a way. In fact, someone who wrote to me, people have just started reading the book and sending me an email, and one of them, a woman, she said to me, Olive is a mystery wrapped up in an enigma. Oh, because, from those places you still get so little.
Yeah. Some other questions? We've just got a little bit more time. Yes, just down here. Sorry. Thanks.
Thank you. Your book has been on my bedside table the last few weeks, so I've been enjoying it. I was just going to ask about, so Max came from, his father's interest in the human form and the sort of physicality and gymnasium thing. And so it's sort of interesting. I just wondered if you can comment on her, I guess, her way of seeing, to what degree it was kind of, we can see that perhaps in that image of Max after surfing, that sort of strong physicality, but then there's also a sense that she moves away from that. And I just wondered if you have a thought on that.
Yes. Now that's an interesting question, because you could say, well, she moves away from portraiture and that preoccupation then with the human subject. But in fact, because she has the commercial studio in Cowra, that really is all portraiture. So the portraiture is still there, and the people do have that physicality, that kind of presentness still in the world. But of course, the really sensuous stuff that comes from the 30s and 40s, that belongs to youth too. Yeah. That's a phase when those people are in their 20s and 30s. They're all gorgeous. They're designers. They make their own clothes. They copy patterns out of Vogue. They help each other do this and that. They go to the Ballet Russe. They're all out there listening to music. So that informs, I think, the whole image of the body as a really vital, lived-in body. And a lot of people, of course, their sexual relations, I tried to work out all that stuff. It was a really Puritan era, in fact. All those scholars of the history of sexuality in Australia, they do point that out. And yet people were not doing as the church and the state and their parents told them. There was, a whole lot of stuff going on, there's no doubt about that. How much in Olive and Max's case and that I could never work out, and in the end it's not my business to, but so a lot of that sexuality is display, I feel. That
the Max after surfing.
Yeah, and some of the other photographs that you'll see of them. I mean, because people, like, to even photograph the nude was pretty brave, because I think there was a great quote from Damien Power's biography. Damien Power was a great friend of Olive's and Max's, and when he was killed they were extremely distraught. But the biographer points out that for a woman to go out to town without a hat and her gloves and her handbag was considered whorish behaviour. So there were very strict principles in operation. And then you see the cover of the book is Olive on a camp with her friends, including Max Dupain, down at the south coast. And look how liberated and free they look. That's a whole alternative. It's youth culture, but clearly it's a liberationist sort of aesthetic is in operation there too. Yeah.
Great question. Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Did she ever experiment with colour photography?
No, she didn't really. Now, I don't think she took a position against it in the way Max Dupain did, because Dupain was adamant that colour photography could not be a creative pursuit. But I think that for Olive, the black and white, she just loved being able to do that creative printing work in the darkroom. And so, no, that's where she stayed. A little bit of colour in the studio, and she did do some hand colouring of portraits for Cowra people. But no, black and white was really her thing. And that drawing with light, that relates to that because of the patterns and the tones. So the drawing is moving through those tones. She doesn't use a lot of contrast, like not a lot of black and white. She operates a lot in that middle range of tones. And that again gives you the softness and the sensuousness.
Great. Another question over here.
There's a kind of a weightlessness, an absence of gravity in much of her work. You know, where horizons will disappear. There's lots of skies. To what extent is that an aesthetic choice, and to what extent do you think that comes from her personality?
Yeah. Well, if only I knew. But I think that weightlessness, absolutely. I think that is definitely a concern of hers. And I was interested in with her because when she comes back to photography, she is ageing, right? And her last photograph, the really great one, Moths on the Window Pane, 1995. So she's 84 when she takes that. I don't know about you, but I find that really comforting to think that you can just keep on smashing it, you know, till you're 84, because that's what we all want to do. So she has that she's, still able to do that. And I was looking at what is the difference between the early and the late photographs. And I think in the late photographs, you do find there's more sky, like the horizon is lower down, and there is this greater abundance of sky. But because she does do that earlier too, it's not like the late great break that you do see with some artists, where what they do later is different to what they do earlier. And there's this wonderful work by Edward Said, some of you might know him, but he talks about why he loves Beethoven and people in particular who have this late great style, which is a going against. It's a refusal to accept serenity. And it's he likes that fact that nothing is resolved. But in Olive's case, in her last photographs, that weightlessness is very much about serenity and acceptance. So she doesn't show you a going against. She actually gives you something else, which is, I think,
we talked about
comforting.
that with sunflowers, the sunflower heads.
Yeah.
Yes, as well.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But nice question. Any other questions? Yes, in the middle here. Just got time for a couple more.
Hi, Helen.
Hello.
You talked about the absence of archival materials, which must have been very difficult then to start your project. But I did notice that one of the photographs you had in here was of a trunk. It said it was a trunk of all her possessions from Sydney. Do you want to talk about what that revealed, if anything?
Yeah. So that trunk is another metaphor. Remember I said I'm desperate for metaphors. And so that trunk is what Olive used to bring her belongings from Sydney down to the country in 1946. So it's a sea trunk. You'd hope that it was going off to Sri Lanka and to, journeys to all around the world and off to England or wherever people might have gone at that time. But it's just transporting her things from Sydney to Cowra. And then in that trunk, I'm sure that over time, and the family will be able to tell you this, there was a lot of sorting that went on. But by the time I looked at it, there were the things from the Sydney years that had never been incorporated into her current life. So it was the concert programs of the concerts she'd attended in Sydney in the 30s. It was the books that she had got as school prizes. She was a stellar student. Not only were her family luminaries, but she was extremely talented. I mean, even at age 7 in her school report, it said something like, she's got leadership potential. We're talking in 1918. So there were things in the trunk that were very revealing like that. But what it revealed to me most was that she wasn't worried about trying to sort everything out ahead of her death. That's what I mean about this acceptance. And she's not trying to, like other photographers that we would know, catalogue everything for posterity and try and establish a view, which will become a received view. She would leave everything open there. So for someone like me, I could, in that case, with fortunately the support, especially from Sally, be able to look through the things that were left behind.
What would she make of this?
I don't know. I think she would probably be surprised to see herself like that. I think she would be thrilled that we are interested in her work, because she was always so thrilled. She wouldn't expect acclamation or devotion, but yeah, I hope that she would like it. But of course, in the end, this is my story of her life. It's not her story, and I recognise
and the beautiful part in the book, and if you've got a question, please put up your hand. Great. Where's the comments book for an exhibition here in Canberra?
Yes, it was here at the library actually. They kept a visitor's book, you know, where you write things in, and I just did an analysis of the key words and how many times beautiful or sensuous or lovely or gorgeous and there was just such an outpouring from people that way. And people were very genuinely moved, like really touched by her photography. That's what I still hope that the book will do too, that there's that space there for you to make connections yourselves with some photographs, and then to pursue them, to go online, certainly, but to go to the collections that are around the country here at the National Gallery and look at the works.
And I think probably the last question here.
Okay, thank you. It's been very interesting. You mentioned just a shift of focus from Olive to you, and you mentioned something about a number of devices that you used at the very beginning to write biography.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you could share your secrets.
Yeah, so for me, that's right, that this was a project triggered by my interest in Olive Cotton's photographs, and that's the thing, it's about art and photography. But it's equally then about Olive's life. And then this other category is about biography. So I have used all the way through reflections on biography, and I do refer to other biographies like by Hermione Lee, by Robert Dessay and so on. I use Robert Dessay's device of listening, because when he's a biographer, he speaks about listening to the environments in which his subjects had lived. And I never even thought of doing that. So I do choose those sorts of devices. And that book, Footstepping by Richard Holmes, where he's going to follow a journey, to go everywhere where his subject had been. So I did that kind of stuff as well. And what's interesting for me now is I'm writing another biography where I can't do the footstepping, so I have to think about what else, you put in the biographical space. So yeah, there's lots of reflections. Janet Malcolm about the biographer being the trespasser, like being the burglar.
Yeah.
The burglar in the house, going through all the drawers and, lifting up the undies and looking under there, and that sense of transgression. And I was always aware of that too. So yeah, there are reflections on biography. But the way I've tried to structure the book is like it's life, it's work, it's these reflections on photography, it's that kneading of the dough thing I was talking about. And then sometimes it's just the documents themselves that will speak for something. The one document that absolutely threw me was in the divorce proceedings. Olive was visited at the studio by the stenographer from the law firm that represented Max Dupain in the divorce, because of course it's not the no-fault divorce era. You had to prove adultery or desertion, and in their case they were going on the basis of Olive's desertion. And so the case was to do with the restitution of conjugal rights to Max Dupain. So the stenographer turns up with two things. One is £1, and the other is the address of Max Dupain's parents, so that there is no financial impediment for Olive to take the bus back to where Max is, and no confusion about the address because he was staying there with his parents. So that meant there could be nothing that would stop her going home to him and restoring the conjugal rights. So she takes the £1, she does sign the papers, but needless to say, she doesn't follow through, and then of course they're able to proceed on the next stage of the divorce proceedings.
Look, I think it is now for you to read the book. Don't just buy one copy. It's we've got too much stuff. We need great writing. We need great stories, and the story of a really, truly a great artist. Helen Ennis, you've done the most extraordinary job. Just writing the other biography, have you painted the room a different colour? Or?
Oh, I'm thinking about that. I
Red?
will. I don't know. It won't be red. I don't know what it will be yet, but it will be a different colour.
And look, I really do congratulate Helen Ennis on a beautiful, beautiful book. And it's so lovely that Olive's family are here tonight. And please go out and enjoy this. Buy many copies, get them signed, talk to Helen. But thank you so much for coming tonight in celebration of this great work and great writer.
Thanks, Alex.